Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Łukasz Michalski, and I have the honor and privilege to lead the National Publishing Institute here in Warsaw. And today we are going to talk a little bit about a new book which have just published. It's a book by Costică Brădățan, professor in many universities, so including mostly Texas, but also Australia. Also did some things in India, as far as I remember. Right now, also doing stuff in Poland. So a very famous and distinguished philosopher. Who have written a book which in original is called The Dangerous Lives of Philosophers. Actually originally printed by Bloomsbury, so one of the greatest, let's say, humanistical publishing houses in States. And we have the honor, because Professor Brădățan agreed for us to do the Polish translation, so we did. And the book is very, I would say, untypical one, but I will say a few words after. And right now, welcome, Professor. It's so good to have you here in Warsaw.
Thank you so much, Łukasz. I'm pleased. I'm happy to be here, and it's a very fortunate circumstance that I happen to be here at the time of the book's Polish launch. Because I'm a fellow, as you mentioned, I'm a fellow a proud fellow at the Polish Institute of Advanced Studies, which is a very fine institution.
Yeah, as you can see, we're going to talk just the two of us, which of course has nothing to do with pandemia, and it's just the question that we were unable to find anywhere in the world good enough panelists for Professor Brădățan. So that's why we are here, just in a lovely tandem. But right now, let me exercise my rights of a owner of the publishing house, or rather the head of it, and let me say a few words about the book, starting with why we actually were interested in it. First of all, I must say that as I am not a professional philosopher, although I was nearly doing my PhD on philosophy, but actually I'm a historian. So this is in one hand, I would say, advantage and disadvantage. Disadvantage, of course, because this book is a very professional philosophical essay. If you expect here to find just a lovely blah blah in a very American style about how a few philosophers lived and died, you will be strongly disappointed. Or rather, you will run off screaming, because it's a truly deep thing and a very eruditive one. But on the other hand, the very theses or statements which are made by Professor in this book are, I would say, dedicated to the regular man. They are somehow dedicated to those who maybe even don't know they're trying to be philosophers, but actually they do because of the way they're conducting their lives. And in many senses, this is something which made us being very, very interested in the case. And the other thing is that as we are a publishing house, and we have to look on the commercial aspect of it. So, as you know, probably today it's very en vogue to be controversial or revolutionary. So the book of Professor Brădățan is controversial and revolutionary, of course, in this lovely sense that it brings us back to the very original idea of how the philosophy should be exercised. So, because the book takes us back to ancient Greece, mostly, in the very idea, through it goes then up to today, nearly. It's absolutely revolutionary today. I mean, as far as I remember, there not even once mentioned Derrida in this book. Come on, I mean, you are a brave man, Professor. Today it's really kind of a bravery. Okay, so going to the very matter. First of all, what I would like to ask you is something which I think you stressed most here. So the very question of death being kind of not only the subject of the reflection, because this is quite obvious thing. I mean, we do have reflection on death from the very, very beginning of our civilization, and in many aspects, not just philosophy. But what you do is you say, if I understand it correctly, you say, well, you have to think about your death and somehow prepare for it in that sense to understand what philosophy really is, because the truly aspect of what philosophy should be is not writing about it, it's not talking about it as we do right now, but is living by it, is somehow putting the very philosophy of yourself into your lives, which unfortunately sometimes ends with death because of this. And that's the approach. So do I understand it well?
Right. That's precisely the point. You capture the argument I'm making. We in the West, we tend to see philosophy primarily as a discipline. We've come to see philosophy as an academic discipline, as a form of theorizing, of understanding the world, and so on, providing an explanation and so on. But I'm not saying it's new. It's been for a while, but it's one facet, one part of the story. Because for a long time, from Plato's, from Socrates more exactly, till now, and also in other parts of the world, in Asia, in Buddhism, in Taoism, and so on, philosophy has been meant to serve as a form of improving your life, of curing you of your fear of death, of your anxieties, of your apprehensions, and so on. Philosophy has been meant to serve as a way of life, to inspire people to live better lives and to be better equipped to deal with life's problems and so on. So if we do accept that form of philosophy, that definition of philosophy, which has happened for a long time, and if we do have philosophers who embrace this practice, then what happens next, and we have so many examples, what happens is sometimes, not always, not very often, but it does happen sometimes, somebody like this, a philosopher, a practitioner like this, will get in trouble. And he or she will reach a point where they will have to put their philosophy to the test. The example, of course, is Socrates. He practiced philosophy primarily as a way of life. Of course, he interrogated, had dialogues with Athenians. In Plato's reading of him, he tried to come up with theories, or he inquired a lot, and so on. But primarily, the picture of Socrates we have from Greek sources is of a practical man, of a philosopher who used philosophy as a way of life, as an art of living, and who, because of that, one day got in trouble and had to practice philosophy in the limit situation when he was to deal with the city, the cities going after him, the trial, and so on. So that's what when you have practiced, lived your philosophy in that way, and then you reach a point where you have to deal with a court of law and so on, you don't have many options left. You really have to live your philosophy. You really have to live by it, and you have to embody your philosophy. It's not, stepping back, apologizing, fleeing into a different city. That's not an option, because that would invalidate what you've been doing all your life. People like him were forced, because of the kind of philosophy they had chosen to practice, they were forced to produce a certain response.
Yeah, I would say that, there's so many interesting aspects in what you've just said, and let me, because I do have a list of questions, but I think that it's much better if we'll just follow the way you'd like to approach to describing your own book. So I would start with this, that yes, I mean, this is also one thing which should be said to our dear audience, that if anyone expects here a huge list of philosophers who died because of what they were saying, that's not the case here. The very idea of this book is rather to represent a special, different kinds of approach to connection between ideas and death. And from that point of view, Professor Brădățan just shows us the very distinguished examples of that different approaches, which actually leads me to at least two very important questions, and because later on I would like to ask you also about the religious context, which I think is very important here and is very important in your book, but in very special ways, so we have to discuss it, I think. But as you mentioned, Socrates, who is one of the most important character in your book, of course, because he's kind of a idiom for death of a philosopher. But in this very death, there is also a quite different aspect, which I think is worth mentioning, especially in today's time. Because what I find in your book, but just not only in your book, but in many recently published decent philosophical books, is kind of either straight, either put underfoot, but the statement that what's really important in philosophy and in general in approaching or exercising any kind of idea spectrum or ideology is to treat yourself and the others seriously. Because what you can find right now, for example, it's very common that people are acting like what was described by Aristotle in Paidokratea. So they just simply they protest for something. Let's say they're breaking the law because, well, yeah, that's what citizen disobedience means. You're breaking the law, and you're you should follow the consequences, which they don't. They usually said, "Oh no, you can't arrest me. I just smashed your shop or whatever, or I just called you a bloody racist." But no, you can't touch me. So they're acting like a 5-year-old brat, and that's what, in my opinion, is very also interesting. That one of the, I don't think maybe the most important motivation for Socrates is the respect for the community law, because why exactly, which you can find not only in Phaedon, which you mostly mention, but in Criton mostly. What's really important here is that, well, even if we are judged unfairly, we are judged by our own community, and if what we do all our lives is to teach people how to live fairly and just, we cannot escape the consequences, even if those consequences are ultimate. And I think that this is also the lesson which should be listened very, very carefully today by everyone. And also it should be maybe exercised more.
No, absolutely. It's Socrates was not a big lover of the Athenian democracy, but he knew one thing: people need institutions and need laws. And so if we have decided to, we got together and decided upon following some laws, it's really, some of us may disagree, but we have to follow them, to observe them. Otherwise, it's just everything is going to collapse. And we have a very, I'm coming from the States, a very recent example where you have what happens after Trump lost.
Yeah, this attack on.
Exactly, the capital. Luckily, so far, the system resisted. I mean, there is a number of laws, of institutions, of pockets, and it didn't collapse. But it came very close, because the president had
but the basics, the legitimacy of community might collapse.
But you could see how close it came, And the whole point was observing some rules. Many people, left and right, were disappointed with the outcome. But yet you have to stick to some rules, just like Socrates in Crito. Otherwise, it will be hell.
And if I may add one little thing, because there is a funny thing which also comes out of this book, and I love it up to some extent, because it's when you are a philosopher, at least from what I know from my friends, philosophers, usually those who are the mostly respected are analytical philosophers. Nobody really reads them, but everybody says it's oh my God, those has this logic, mathematical ideas. Then there are usually ontologists going mostly into phenomenology. They say, oh yeah, those guys, yeah. And there is kinds like political philosophy. It is a philosophy, but it's not very serious. But actually, when you read your book, for example, you can, without any doubts, find out that, yes, maybe that's how it is, but actually it's a really rare situation that somebody is going to be persecuted because of his ideas on the Gadamer's hermeneutics, but it's actually quite possible to be killed because of critics of totalitarian regime, which comes out straightly from political philosophy. So it's kind of very interestingly spoken and given the proof of importance of deep thing about politics. I don't know if this was consciously done in your book, but evidently it comes out of it. So,
well, I'm happy to see that. I'm not sure I had a plan. I don't think I had a plan to go there, but there is an impulse. some kind of political, in a very broad and noble sense, political.
As paideia, I mean,
exactly.
That's what I mean.
I grew up in Eastern Europe, in this part of the world, and I was growing up doing nothing more at the time in the 70s and 80s. But then the system in place at the time was oppressive, was humiliating, was crippling, was unworthy of a civilized society. And what was interesting, which is something I realized later, was how people respond. Most of us in most places, gave in. We just went with the flow. We obeyed. But very few, a handful of people in Poland, a handful in Czechoslovakia, some in Russia and Hungary, decided to go against and to risk everything to say something against the regime. And that was, of course, in the end, you don't know. They played a minor role, some of them minor, some of them more important, but in the end, you don't know why the regime collapsed, the whole system. It was just a few years before, or even weeks before, specialists, in the late 89, many Sovietologists had no idea that the system was about to collapse. And yet, those people, minor figures, priests and philosophers and patočka and ordinary people did something that in the long run affected the construction, the stability of the system. And again, we do not know whether those individuals had a major role to play in the collapse, but we do know that through what they did, they offer an example. They stood up and they said, well, they showed it's possible. It's possible. And that was big. That was big. And that was, to go back to your original question, that was perhaps one of the impulses of my book. Of course, I was a kid at the time. I was a child, but somehow those things stayed with me.
But this thing stays. Yeah, I know it perfectly well. Well, we didn't have that hard experience as Romanians, of course. But martial law time wasn't a piece of cake either. So I agree strongly. Okay, let me then go to a little bit different aspect of this thing, because what's obvious here is the very tight line which divides dying for ideas from martyrdom, especially that in many cases the thing is really confused, and also as you can read, for example, in a marvelous book by Dariusz Karłowicz, The Paradox of Death, which is on the martyrs, early martyrs, but the philosophical approach to the very martyrdom as a category, it also functions in philosophy. So, there are things which are very, very difficult to distinct. You mentioned one of my beloved character or hero in the history. We even published his book because we started a special series of books which is called Contra Leviathan, and those are books done by men who exercise exactly what you are talking about. So they, because of the idea they are believed, they decided to fight the oppressive state. And our first book we published was the Prison Letters by Sir Thomas More, because I think it's one of the greatest books ever written. And also has this very important Socratic aspect of obeying the laws, but obeying the consequences, but not agreeing personally because of your own conscience for evil. And Well, he's a saint of Catholic Church. He is considered a martyr. Was this a martyrdom or was this a death for ideas? Let me add one more example, which might be a little bit strange, but I think very important. That would be John Paul II, who actually didn't die in this but nearly. Interesting part of it is that actually Saint John Paul II was the first philosopher on the papal throne. He was not theologist, he was philosopher. He actually specialized in Scheller. And what he did, mostly to theology, was he had this great deal of concern on human dignity and personal dignity, which actually changed the world in many aspects, including helped a great deal helped the fall of communism. And that's exactly why he was shot. So this is the same thing. I mean, was he shot because he was Catholic, head of Catholic Church, the boss, or was he shot because what he was actually believing and doing because of the belief started to change the many aspects of political world in the very time? I'm really interested how you do this distinction.
Right. Obviously, I'm using in the book the very phrase martyr philosopher. So martyrdom, in the sense of religious martyrdom, plays a major role in the terminological layer of the book. I'm always keep an eye on religion, on what's going on in religion, and religion has a longer history of and more substantial and more intense history of dying for a cause. More exactly, dying for God, for faith, for God. You are, as a believer, Christian, Muslim, anything, Buddhist, you are sometimes put in a situation to die, right? You have to, they ask you to make a choice, and you insist on remaining who you are, and you do not give up your faith, and you don't give up your God, and you decide to die for faith and for your God. But that's a very unique situation. It's also very clearly cut, clearly presented. You die for God. There is almost some kind of, which I'm using in the book, martyrological pact. I'm dying for God, and instead I'm getting something. There'll be some salvation,
there's some kind of reward,
a crown, a martyrdom. There is an eternal bliss, eternal salvation. I'll be living a better life in some other world. What's interesting in philosophy, that is not what happens. Philosophers who die for their ideas may be believers, but not necessarily. With Socrates, in Plato's dialogues, it looks like he's a believer in some form of immortality, but it's difficult to say because, immortality in ancient Greece.
Yeah, it's very vague. Yeah,
exactly. And others were openly atheists. So they accidentally, they may happen to be believers, but practically, essentially, they don't die for God. They die essentially for nothing, and that's scandalous. That's absurd. Those people die because they cannot do otherwise, because they have to, because they feel if they do not die, if they surrender, something terrible will happen to their heritage, to their life project, to their philosophical project. And of course, we do have some cases like Thomas More, where one and the same person is both a martyr philosopher and a martyr proper. That was actually one more reason to have him there, even if some scholars said, well, his place is not there because he's placed in the church's calendar.
Oh, absolutely, one of the greatest philosophers of his time. So
it's exactly so. It's because you can die for your religious, theological, Catholic ideas, which was his case. somehow his case complicates my story, but that's good, I think. That's
it brings marvelous,
it brings in nuance, it brings in more context, more texture. It shows, it points to the different possibilities that there are. That again, we don't know Patočka, for example, whether he believed in some God or not. It's of course, or Giordano Bruno. Giordano Bruno, even if he was a monk, a Dominican monk, his idea of immortality was very peculiar, very heretic. He believed in some form of immortality, but not your typical Christian immortality, personal existence in some other world. So it's complicated, but the problem remains, and the whole the persecution and the prosecution and the process and the need for an audience, the need for witnesses, and the whole social process that martyrdom involves are both are largely the same in both cases.
Okay. Yes, I agree. I mean I agree that this is one of the most interesting aspects here. That you are really doing a very clear distinction, but on the other hand, you are saying it's a thing which is not that easy or not that obvious. One can think for the very first time. Okay, let me follow for a moment this religious aspect, but not in the sense of asking you of religion in your book, because it's not about it. But that reminds me a phrase put in one of the greatest novels of 19th century, of Polish Nobel winner writer Henryk Sienkiewicz in Quo Vadis, which is a great appreciation of Christianity and martyrdom itself, but Christianity first of all. And in one of the scenes there, the young Marek Vinicius, who struggles, who doesn't know what to choose, everything which is truly Roman inside him oppose against Christianity, everything which is love and experience pushes him to it. And he says to Petronius that, well, yes, I mean the Stoicists, the Stoic, they taught us how to die, but they didn't teach us in any way how to live. And this sentence somehow reflects in my mind in many aspects while reading your book. Because one of the things which I think is crucial, absolutely, to this book, and one of the things why I'm so happy to be able and honored to publish it, is because what you are trying to make is this connection between death and way of living, not living in biological sense, as necessity, as kind of a necessity in exercising the true meaning of philosophy. I mean, if you really want to be serious thinker, you have to decide what your very ideas are, and you have to prepare to follow them till death, which means you have to expect death in the very aspects you are conducting your life. That's why probably you're mentioning Montaigne so much. But that sounds really fascinating, because this is also the aspect here, which actually, for example, the Seneca is a very good example of philosophers who actually were not exactly living the way they were teaching, and not exactly following, and definitely not following the very ideas up till death. So my true question is, what is exactly this drive? Because this is something I'm, because I have to say something critical, for God's sake. If I lack something here, is the question, okay, if not religion, because if religion, we understand it clearly, it's an obvious thing, as you said. But if not religion, then what's the drive? I mean, what drives you? What you do is you say you should, and the very philosophy is life, it's not writing. Okay, so what's the drive? Why?
That's a good question, because typically, under normal conditions, religion provides a major drive. It's a force. It gives you a big push to live in a certain way, to behave in a certain way, to die for your faith, because there'll be a reward. The reward is so big that anything is worth paying, or any price is worth paying. But when you live the philosophical life, the rewards are never clear. And what's the drive? It's a good question. Probably we need to talk to those people. Well, we need to look into their biographies. You mentioned Seneca, which is a very interesting example, because he didn't have a place in that book.
I understand.
For some reason.
That's the why.
But he does have a place in the book I'm finishing now, In Praise of Failure. He failed in many ways, but also in a very human way. He failed to practice what he taught, what he preached, right? Because he served Nero. He wasn't just, his speechwriter or his advisor, but he wrote he was part of the political agenda. He wrote Seneca composed Nero's letters, in which he explained why he killed his brother, why he killed his mother, and so on. It's just, Seneca's biography was so messed up by his involvement.
Well, yeah, but when I was mentioning Seneca, it was a little bit, because it's not actually the question of just Seneca. I mean, to be absolutely honest, writing a book about those, even listing those who truly followed their ideas up till very death, would be a really, really short list compared to the very thinkers, even very confident of themselves, and who actually didn't follow it in any aspect. And this link would be huge, especially we East Europeans know tons of guys like this, and unfortunately also in the West, concerning the communism and so I think it is important. I mean, because the experience shows, as I'm a historian, the experience shows that this drive, which is not motivated religiously, not very effective, I would say, especially if we are comparing those two lists. And that's why that's why my question is: what exactly would you describe the drive?
Okay, again, we are struggling. It's an important question, and I think it depends. It varies from case to case. If I'm thinking, for example, of a Havel, because it just occurred to me, he answers your question in one place. He says, "Look, many people admire me for my bravery, for my involvement, for so and so on." But he says, "Actually, I'm a coward. I'm afraid. I've always, all those years in prison, I was terrified by the fear of my consciousness." So what you have here is shame. Those people, Havel, by his own account, by maybe others, are afraid of being ashamed. It's a drive. That's a drive. It works in many cases. If you don't do that, if you surrender, if you go against what you've preached, something terrible will happen.
So everyday mirror as a drive.
Right, you lose face. You lose face not in front of others, but in front of yourself, and that's a drive. That can be a drive. In other cases, a different drive could be the heritage, what you leave behind, how people will see you 100 years later, 200 years later. You want to leave, you want to project a decent, an honest heritage. You want to be perceived as somebody who led a decent life, and pay the price, and didn't betray himself. That's why, again, some people do care about how the kind of heritage they leave behind.
There is, I think, also one aspect which we didn't mention, but just correct me if I'm wrong, please. You are actually not mention them very often. I'm very much in those in this literature, so I would say what I'm trying to refer to is Solzhenitsyn, Shalamov, because as you mentioned, Havel actually, well, he was a great intellectual, but we're a little bit getting out of philosophy understood precisely this way. I mean, he never described himself as a philosopher. He was rather, he understood himself as a writer. Same thing was, definitely same thing was Solzhenitsyn or Shalamov or Yevgenia Ginsburg or many other person like this. Why am I mentioning them? Because I think that there is also other drive which, of course, mostly is driven religiously, but there's no, it's not necessarily religiously. And this is a drive to witness the evil, so to not let it perish in the memory of our followers. So to somehow sustain memory of evil. And this, as we all remember, this phenomenal intro or dedication to Gulag Archipelago, when Solzhenitsyn writes to all those who perished, who lived and perished in the gulags, and let them forgive me of things that I didn't remember, didn't describe, and didn't, because, so in philosophical way of approaching this sentence, we say the most important failure is agreeing for forgetfulness. And in this sense, the meaning of being a witness might be much more important than your own life. Usually, of course, it means that you preserve your life somehow. So, because the witnesses, as they do the statement, usually are those who preserved. But in the very sense, they already put their life on full risk. They somehow were persecuted. And I think that maybe, I don't know how, if you consider this very idea, the idea of witnessing the evil, of giving the statement as an important drive, not religious drive to it.
No, that's an important topic. Of course, it could not be part of the book, because otherwise it would have been a never-ending book.
Yeah, and 12 tomes.
I totally see your point, and probably what you have there is a collective experience of suffering, of almost, ultimate suffering close to destruction. So you have this a community of and then survivors. Solzhenitsyn and his fellow Czechs, right, and living for years and years in the camps, and as you live there, by day you develop this sense that you have to bear witness, you have to tell the story, and the longer you live, the longer the more time passes, there's this sense of duty to bear witness, to write an account. Grows and grows and grows, and you feel suddenly you realize you find yourself in a position where you don't really care about your life. it has got into your mind that the mission of your life is to come up with an account, to do it.
Wiesel, isn't it?
Exactly, Wiesel, and exactly. As you were talking, I was thinking of the Holocaust survivors. So Wiesel, Primo Levi, and Amery, and a number of others, who, for a number of years, lived along with others who did not survive, who were crushed, who were killed, who disappeared. If you manage to survive, you have this fundamental obligation to bear witness, to tell the story. And that keeps you living, but also gives you energy and drive to oppose.
I think that what's important here is that when you are supposed to give a statement, are supposed to be a witness, you have to be credible. And in this sense, you have to follow your own ideas. You cannot submit.
Right.
And that's where the connection is.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Because it's a valid, it's a powerful statement if your life is pure. You do not, if you sign the pact with the devil, if you make compromises, your account, no matter how beautiful, is not. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, my dear Anna, do we have any question? No, we don't have any question. Yeah, that was quite obvious because probably people who are even listening right now, they might have some problems with English. Let me now tell you, my dear ladies and gentlemen, our dear internet followers, that this whole discussion with Professor Costică Brădățan would be subtitled in Polish and could be seen later on on our page or our Facebook page and YouTube page. But what's most important here, ladies and gentlemen, buy, read, and enjoy this absolutely marvelous piece of human thought. And this marvelous struggle for analysis of one of the most important questions ever asked by men. In short, writes Brădățan, dying for idea, umrzeć za ideę. And today I deeply and from my heart and with great honor, thank you, Professor Brădățan. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Having you here.
The pleasure was mine. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.